we really had a great deep dive into the product, and now I think we have 10-15 minutes to take the questions of the audience. So the first question we have here is, how often are behavioral science principles used in product management?
Yes, very good question. I would say when you are trying to understand a product market fit, or what you basically need to build, you really need to understand who you are building it for. And so essentially we are talking about building products for somebody to use, even if it's a B2B product or a B2C product. At the end of the day, some human being is expected to use a product. So when you talk about behavioral sciences and psychology, you really need to understand what is the emotional state that a user is in when he or she interacts with your product. You really want to understand what kind of benefits are they looking for when they hold their product, when they hold your product in their hands. And so it's really important to be close to users' psyche. And what behavioral science essentially does is it gives you a very clear, or at least tools to kind of form clear perspectives about which user need you would want to prioritize. And I would say frequency, of course, depends on which product you're building. If you're building a product from scratch, you probably would be using it more frequently. If you're scaling a product, you probably would not be using it that frequently. But I would say at any inflection point in your product, a new product launch or a new feature launch or a new market launch, you would really want to understand, how users would kind of behave when they see a product. But yeah, good question.
Yeah. Next question is, how much does an MBA affect one's journey as a PM?
Okay, I think I missed out on this FAQ. This is also very, very common
Yeah.
question. So, well, I have an MBA. So let me give that disclaimer first. And I also have a very nicely worded blog on Medium, which you should read, which is called "Why Doing an MBA Was a Waste of My Time." So what I would feel is that if it totally depends on what you are trying to get out of MBA. I did an MBA as a fresher, so naturally I had very limited experiences to kind of draw from. But when it comes to product management, I feel that some of the principles of MBA are really, really important. And as I said, some of you might find MBA really, really helpful as well, because what it does is it really polishes your ability to construct hypotheses. Because in MBA case study, especially if I'm assuming you're talking about good MBA colleges, where you have a more case-based approach, you try and understand what different companies have kind of done in the past, what problems they have faced. And it's really important to kind of look at that, study from your classmates and their experiences. I feel that it's an overstatement to say that it was not the best utilization of my time. What I feel is that you really polish your communication. You really polish how to kind of deconstruct a problem into its components, and you think about what we were doing when I was an engineer. You guys are still engineers, so when I was doing my engineering, I would say that a lot of us would be reading books, doing practicals, and maybe some of us would be kind of working on our own startups. But what we essentially were doing we were more theoretical, and we were probably understanding perspectives from a more bookish sense. We were, at least I was not very active into questioning some of the things that was being taught to me. And that is how I would say that an MBA brings, because a case is only a case. You can't read it on internet and read it. You have to use your brain. You have to ask questions, and the better questions that you ask, the better you will find responses. So a short answer is, it depends on what's your kind of way of approaching things. If you really have a scientific approach, if you really are good in communication, and if you really don't want to get into a very specific field within product management, like some of us really, really want that, I want to get into this particular company in this particular role, then of course I would encourage you to find a college or find a school where this company hires for this role. But in all honesty, I would say that probably an MBA is an overstatement. It's a good to have. It's not a must have.
Yeah. So next question is, since the execution part is mostly planning is mostly followed by the execution. So it is with respect to us engineers, like we are usually not that good at predicting the roadblocks. So how to prevent the pitfalls in the roadmap? How to handle this?
Okay. Hmm. Pitfalls. Well, I would say first, it's not about engineers. It's a human thing. I don't see any other function being better at this. Maybe people in maybe astrology, but yeah, I would say that it's very difficult to predict where you would have a pitfall. What is really important is to kind of hedge yourself and de-risk yourself, which I think anybody can learn and be good at. What really is important is to have a very clear picture of where you want your product to be in. Like, what I'm saying is that people pivot, people change the strategy, people do a lot of funny things in between. But if you at least have a good goal in front of us, which is kind of, as I said, you start with asking why am I doing this? What is the vision? If you start with that, even if your route is, let's say, not a point to point route, but let's say it becomes more convoluted, it has pitfalls, etc., you would still be able to kind of traverse and reach your goal with a higher degree of probability. But predicting these pitfalls, I would say you could probably use your intuition. You could use your experiences. You could also discuss with people who are more seasoned, and they can also help you out.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah, it's actually very difficult for me to suggest or kind of a rule of thumb here. It doesn't exist.
yeah, that's more sort of practical thing. Moving on to the next question, we received it from our alumni, one of our alumni. He wanted to basically know that what would be the next disruptor in the way we consume music. Like we have a lot of personalization. Even in
Yeah.
Spotify, we have all sorts of things, liked videos, downloaded playlists, and everything. But what would be the next disruptor here?
Well, I would say we are seeing some of the disruptions already in the content space, especially in the audio content space. So 2 years ago, Spotify was a music company, and now Spotify is an audio network. And by that I mean that we don't just have music, we have podcasts and we have audiobooks. We recently introduced videos as well. So I would say that the value proposition itself is quite dynamic in this case. Like, we, for almost more than 10 years now, we've been a music company, and now suddenly we are an audio company. And what that means, especially, I can probably talk about my role, and that means that I need to start communicating the value proposition to the users at the point of them downloading or just signing up. And yeah, you can imagine having 300 million users trying to download your application and go through your onboarding flows every year. It's very difficult to really understand and predict which user would like podcast, which user would like music, which user would like both. At what point should you introduce a podcast to a user? Which market is more suited for podcast compared to music? So there are these questions and these different considerations which are defining the music industry in general, and Spotify in particular. Spotify is, I would say, spent more than $500 million in the last 12 months on acquiring podcast licenses and content. You might have heard about Michelle Obama and those kind of really influencers coming on our platform. So what I feel is that that is one. The second is, within the content space itself, one very important thing to know is music is like a commodity. So you think about Apple Music, you think about Wink Music, one of the products which I built long ago. You think about Gun or Savan, or I think it's now JioSavan. But yeah, you think about all of these different music applications, and almost all of them have the same content, which is what a commodity is. Like, especially people from economics would know that commodities, when you have a commoditized behavior, it's very difficult to differentiate your product from different competitors. And what I feel is this is important for people to appreciate that the more originals and exclusives and those kind of content you bring onto your platform, the better your chances of retaining a user, the better your lifetime value would be. And part of the reason why Spotify is investing heavily in podcasts is to double down on the originals and exclusives opportunity. What Netflix did 10 years ago with its shows like Breaking Bad and those kind of shows, is essentially what we would like to do. And I would say, in terms of the other things, I would say it's also about localization and hyper personalization. Now, we've always, as Spotify, we've been one of the best companies on this planet in terms of having really personalized experiences and journeys. But we also see this scope to kind of regionalize and localize some of our machine learning models about predicting user behavior, about driving demand, and creating those personalized workflows for users, which would be relevant for different markets. So some of these Western companies like Amazon Music and Spotify or Apple, they have kind of evolved from a more Western mature audience, and now they're coming into and these more emerging markets because they have more or less saturated some of those opportunities there. So now when we think about these, I'll give an example. Let's say if the way an Indian searches for a content is very different from a way a Japanese searches for a content, which is very different from a way an American would search for a content. And almost half of the users on these platforms, they take a search-led approach. Like they will search for their content. No matter how great your algorithm is, your recommendation algorithm is, you would still find a lot of people going for search. And so localizing the search is super important. And if you are a machine learning engineer, you would know that there is something called as a broad intent query. You have people who would give you such a broad intent that you would not be able to figure out what is he or she trying to search for. These are some of the trends which were, I would not say overlooked, but these were some of the trends which were probably part of that long tail that product managers kind of typically said that we will address them or we'll attack those issues later on as our product matures. And I would say now is that stage when they are emerging, when they're targeting these emerging markets. And that's where some of these things become very important. So yeah, I would say these are some of the things which at least come to the top of my mind.
Yeah. So the next question we have here is, how important are growth hacks while building early stage products? Can you share some personal anecdotes on the same?
Sure. But in fact, maybe if you could repeat the second part of the question one more time.
How important are growth hacks while building early stage products? And could you share your personal experience with the same?
Okay, early stage products. Okay. So
Yeah.
I feel growth hacks, I don't know whether they're hacks or not, but essentially supercharging your growth can be done through various channels, and it is very important. So while not going necessarily into how you can supercharge growth, a short answer is yes, it's super important. You could be a startup. You could have, let's say, maybe about 10,000 downloads right now, or you could have, let's say, 1 lakh downloads. And what you might be wanting is to kind of take your product to a much wider audience. And you probably might have limited amount of funds to kind of take this or travel this journey. So building these product hacks and growth levers in your product is super important. As I already gave the example of Uber, how they did some part of it. One very beautiful thing which Spotify actually did almost 10 years ago was they created this cross posting on Facebook. Like if you could actually post which song you were listening to on Facebook, and that's how they kind of grew their user base 10, 12 years ago. My personal example, I would say there have been a lot of them actually, because I've worked on some of the early stage companies. Let me take the example of Hike Messenger, for instance. So at Hike Messenger, we built things called as immersive animations. We also built GIF sharing features, and how we kind of went about, although these were not early stage products, but Hike was not an early stage product, but these were new features that we built. And how we went about kind of popularizing or familiarizing the users with this feature was essentially you build product levers, and you build things like, if let's say if I share this feature to you, then you would probably get upgraded in terms of your app version. So if let's say if I send you an immersive animation, then you as the end receiver would first not be able to see what this animation is, because you would probably be on an older version of the application, or you would not have the feature enabled for you. But the moment you share that feature to, you should share that immersive animation to your receiver, that person automatically gets upgraded to the latest version of the application, and they would also have the feature enabled for them. So what that means is that if you selectively target the influencers in the community, you can then use their power of, or you can use their network to kind of spread the word. They can spread the feature, and you don't really have to go and target everybody. You can selectively cherry pick the users, and they would do this supercharging work, and they would do this proliferation of the product feature for you. So this, and of course there are multiple examples as well, but I would say this one comes to my mind because although the product itself was fairly mature, but the feature itself was quite new, and it was very different from what we had at that point of time. So it was a very innovative and a new way of expressing yourself. So yeah, I mean that certainly is very important, and especially when you are when you don't want to pay or have a paid growth, you don't want to have digital marketing around it. That's those product hacks or those product led growths are super important as well.
Yeah, cool. Someone here wants to know some specific resources that you would like to suggest for like solving product related cases.
Well, I would say there are a lot of resources that I could see on Udemy and those kind of learning platforms. Although I have not kind of had a first-hand experience of all these courses, but I've heard good things about them. So you could probably take a look at that. And these are typically where you find a lot of cases from product managers, working in different companies. I would say that some of the blogs on Medium are really helpful because they would be written by people who have encountered a particular problem in their product management or in their day-to-day life, and they would have shared some of these questions, and they would probably have also shared the way they solved that problem. And finally, I would say that there are of course really amazing books. Some of them, like as I mentioned, Hooked, or multiple other books I'm sure are there, which would help you understand how some of these companies, in their different stages of their career, they went about solving some of the problems that they had. And I'm sure that anybody who reads these books would get a richer and a better perspective about how those problems need to be solved if they were to encounter those questions in their career.
Yeah, okay. So the next question we have in line is, how do you include the customer support part of a product or feature in the PRD?
Wow, very good question. Very nice. So yeah, I think why I say it nice is because I've seen it firsthand of the negative implications of not having that. I would say for that you need to understand, of course, what a PRD is, and I assume everybody knows it's a product requirement documentation. When you write a PRD, you are essentially telling your team, you're telling yourself and your team, of course, is what is it that you guys would want to do, and how you would want to do, and why you would want to do, the feature or the product. So customer support often gets overlooked. A very recent example is I launched a product for US and other markets, and because of my experiences, I was of course very cognizant of the fact that the product needs to have a user manual or FAQs or those kind of things, which the customer support would need. It's really important because as a product manager, what you really have to appreciate is that you are probably the only body who has the most context of your product. You cannot really expect somebody from support function to basically understand everything about a product by just looking at it. So you really need to have a section in your PRD. If that's how you operate, like if you have a PRD which you share across different functions, then you would really want to have that as the FAQs and the screenshots and those kind of things, troubleshooting, all of those kind of things in your PRD. If you don't want to share your PRD with a larger audience, then that's also fine. But then you really need to create a one pager or a separate document which really covers these things. Yeah, I mean, I would say that it also depends on what product you're building, because if you're building a product which is to be used internally, then you probably would not need a customer support. You'll probably need a more troubleshooting, self-serving kind of a platform. But if you are, like the most of us who create products for end users, then you of course need to have, in some cases, customer support training as well. Like you really need to educate your team of frontline folks who would resolve those questions and queries from the users on how to go about troubleshooting and how to respond to some of the questions. So if, for instance, if let's say WhatsApp tomorrow launches a feature which is I don't know, maybe about shopping. So then they would certainly want their customer support team to be aware of what this feature is about, how it is to be used, what are the potential challenges people might face, and how these customer support people can answer those questions. So it really helps to take the burden off you as well. Like as a product manager, you can't physically respond to every question, and that's not your job as well. So you would want to kind of delegate and make sure that the other person understands it very well, and that's how I would say you should go about it. And why I say this is a very very good and important question is because I've seen 9 out of 10 times people forget this. Because I think it's obvious, like, okay, this probably, why would I expect, the other person not to understand this? But you really need to, be empathetic about the other person, especially folks from the customer support. They may not have the full context of your feature. So it's really important to be mindful of that.
Yeah. How much more time do we have, Rakshit? Like,
I would say about 5 minutes. Is that okay?
yeah. So there are a few questions like how to diversify a view on a particular product to have the most of it while building a new one. Basically, how to get the learning, like exhaustive learning from the iterations we perform.
Again, very good question, and this is more on the execution side. So let's say if you are, if you have a product roadmap and you have some milestones, and you have plan A, B, C, and D, and whatnot, and essentially what you want to do is you want to go about testing your ideas and your product features and your different versions of the product. So at any point of time, you would want to have at least one or two variants of the same product, which is what we call as A/B testing. You would certainly not want to place all your bets on one particular design or one particular feature, one particular user experience. You would want to kind of see how people respond to different ways of solving your problem. So as I said, if you recall the scientific method, so you have a hypothesis, you have a problem, you have a hypothesis, and then you have multiple ways of solving that particular or validating that hypothesis. So each of these ways of validating your hypothesis would be what you would want to kind of test, and you would want to prioritize that testing. So you would probably want to start with the variant or the version that you have most confidence in, because you want to kind of save time as well. So if you have really strong success metrics, if your objectives of running the tests are clear, and if your key outcomes, as I said, the key metrics or the key outcomes, if they're very clear from each level or each step in your iteration, it really becomes quite easy and objective for you to first analyze your existing product or your existing feature, and then kind of seeing it in its totality, whereas you see what is working, what is not working, how it can improve, and the how it can improve part often takes the help of data. Like you analyze the funnel, you analyze how users are engaging with your product, where are the drop-off points, and you basically try and address some of those gaps. Now, those gaps could be addressed by creating an iteration on the feature that you built, or it could mean completely scrapping that particular idea or building something from fresh. So it's a stepped learning, and it's an iterative learning. So you keep building something, testing it, measuring it, and then kind of analyzing the outcomes of those experiments, and do your follow-up work accordingly.
Yeah. So okay, let's take one last question. How do you benefit from the advantages of agile in a big organization like Spotify, considering that every feature launch is big, like with respect to an organization like Spotify?
So I assume that the person who's asking knows what agile is, and for people who may not know, so agile is essentially a way of creating a product. So when I talked about MVP and minimum viable products, typically this fits better into an agile way of working, which is you start with smaller chunks of a particular problem, and then you can kind of keep doing and learning and iterating. The other model is called waterfall model, where you collate all your requirements in one place, and then you just like a waterfall, you keep building it till you reach your goal. Now coming to how agile helps folks, especially big organizations like Spotify or Facebook, I would say that although we have global product launches, but we always have small regional testing. Like as I said, we launched a feature for just 9 markets, in US and a few other markets for podcasts very recently. So although we have global launches, we would like to test our ideas in a smaller market first, which really helps us to kind of control the exposure of that feature. And how agile really helps in that is that you really would like to slice your product idea into smaller chunks. So let's say if I want to build a podcast onboarding, for instance, what I would really not want to kind of do is build it for 1 year and then test it at the end, because there are chances that some of my hypotheses might not be fully not fleshed out, but they may not be fully valid, or even after 1 year, maybe those hypotheses itself could have changed because your market might have changed. So what you really would like to do is slice your bigger product feature or problem that you're trying to solve into smaller chunks, and then you kind of try and sort of chew each of these chunks one at a time. And how you do it is, let's say you build a feature which kind of helps you validate one particular hypothesis, or let's say 2 hypotheses amongst the whole umbrella of hypotheses that you are kind of aiming for on a longer term. And then when you take 1 or 2 of these hypotheses, you would really like to kind of work in an agile manner. You basically would want to run sprints with your team. Sprints are typically 14 days long development cycle. In some cases, they can be 7 days, 21 days as well. So essentially, it's about 2 weeks of development time that you dedicate, where you take this hypothesis. You have a PRD or whatever, and you can probably have some designs around it as well. You may also have user research backing it, and then you just go on those 2 weeks cycle to kind of build towards that feature which will help you validate that hypothesis. Now, by validating that hypothesis, you probably are not answering the whole question, but what you are doing is you're answering one very important part of that question. And typically how it happens is, if you answer all the subcomponents of a particular question, then the question gets solved. And that's how this hypothesis tree also works.
So guys, I hope everyone's doubt have been addressed, and in case you have any more doubts or any more ideas or anything, you can directly connect with Rakshit on LinkedIn and reach out to him for the doubts. We had a really great session, and we'll really like you to be active in such more sessions.